It's me, Yukari. Nah, I'm just joking with you. So this is it. This is the video that I've been working on an idea for a long time, and I'm finally going to fulfill a promise that I made on a YouTube poll that 3 people voted on. God bless them all. And I'm finally going to make a video about Whyte Notation, which is the system of measurement used to track how many wheels a locomotive has and how that determines the steam locomotive's type. Now, for the more pedantic of you, type does not equate to classes. Like a 440 isn't the same as an 812 class Caledonian locomotive. Or a cauliflower, like types and classes are similar, but they're completely different at the same time. So I just want to get that out of the way. So how do you measure a locomotive using Whyte Notation, or how does Whyte Notation work? So Whyte Notation is written as a series of 3 numbers separated by 2 dashes. You have the first number, which details how many pilot wheels are in front of the locomotive. Usually they're in a separate bogie attached to the locomotive, and these usually help to guide the locomotive into curves and switches, and are usually pretty great for adding stability. And these wheels are at the front of the locomotive, usually underneath the firebox or under some sort of extended running plate. The middle wheels are the driving wheels. These wheels are usually coupled, but they can have multiple sets of coupled wheels in which there is a separate number also in the middle detailing the other set of coupled wheels. Unless it's a Garrett, or in that case the wheel arrangement is usually mirrored on the other side, denoted by a plus symbol between the 2 sets of wheels, the 2 sets of wheel arrangements. And the middle wheels are really important because that's the locomotive's ability to put power from the boiler, from the engine itself, onto the wheels to make it move. And usually the more wheels, the more powerful the locomotive is. Usually, sometimes it's not the case. Sometimes it comes down to boiler pressure, sometimes it goes down to the size of the wheels, and sometimes it even goes down to whether or not the heaviest parts of the locomotive are over the driving wheels, but that's outside the scope of this video. Finally, the 4th and final set of wheels, which is at the back, are the trailing wheels. These are usually also in a set of bogies. It's usually in a separate bogie that's underneath the locomotive, usually underneath the cab and the firebox. And this also provides some base level of stability and allows the locomotive manufacturer to put a larger firebox on the frame, So that's the short and sweet part of it. Another thing I'm also going to mention is I'm filming outside because this house only has 2 temperatures, hot and cold, and it's currently hot, so hence why we're doing it outdoors today. Also, I haven't filmed outdoors in a while, so more for me, I guess. Okay, so in this video, I'll be discussing the more common wheel arrangements from the mid-Victorian period of British railway history up until the end of steam. The reason I'm doing that is because I want to simplify the video a little bit and just go over the more common types. I mean, I'll also throw in a couple of the more minor types in just for stuff. Basically, I just don't want to talk about singles all day long. Okay. And if you guys want to know about the singles, there's the 022, the 220, the 222, and the 422. So yeah, there's that out of the way. So let's begin. The 040. So the 040 in the beginning of railway history was a more powerful version of the single locomotives. These engines are usually meant for freight work in the early times of railways, but were soon supplanted by larger locomotives, most notably the 060, but we'll get to the 060 later. The 040 in later years would largely be relegated to tank engines, noted for their small wheelbase, allowing them to negotiate tight curves, such as those in dockyards or industrial areas, or just anywhere where you need a shunting locomotive to negotiate very tight curve radiuses, And that's sort of the short and simple of it. And these locomotives are usually pretty small, like I said before, and are mostly used for tank engines. But again, later in life, they were supplanted by more powerful 060s. The 240 and its cousin, the 042, are the first real large express type locomotives. So the 240 was a very popular wheel arrangement throughout the mid-Victorian era of British railways, and were most notably used in the London North Western Railway President class, which was very famous for the Races to the North, which was an event in railway history in which various railway companies tried to get passengers from London to Edinburgh as fast as humanly possible with these steam locomotives. And London North Western Railway, which owned the West Coast Main Line at the time, was one of the star performers. Other star performers were the Dunlestairs of the Caledonian Railway, and maybe the 422s of the 422 Stirlings of the Great Northern Railway. Don't quote me on that. I am an American, so I'm not a professional at this. So that's really that. 240s have a set of pilot wheels in the front and 4 driving wheels. Obviously, there's a diagram in the corner of this video that will denote the different types of wheel arrangement. Now, the 042 is more interesting because, on one hand, you don't have that as great of stability in the front of the locomotive, but at the same time, you now have trailing wheels at the back, so the crew can have a much better ride in the locomotive, and you can fit a larger firebox. And with a larger firebox, you can heat more water. If you can heat more water, you can raise more steam. If you can raise more steam, that's more steam that can be converted into energy in the cylinders. And when you have more energy coming out of the cylinders, that means you can have a much more powerful locomotive, a much faster locomotive. But towards the 20th century, 042s ended up becoming more of a tank engine variety. Most famously, they were used as the wheel arrangement for the Great Western Railway 14XX class of locomotive. And you know the rest. Now, the 242s. These locomotives are pretty famous for being a type of locomotive most commonly associated with suburban tank engines. And before you ask, what is a suburban tank engine? What makes a tank engine suburban? Does a tank engine live in a house with a nuclear family with a car in the driveway? No. A suburban tank engine is a tank engine designed for commuter rail work. So for those who live in the state of Massachusetts, that would be the equivalent of the diesel locomotives you see on the T. Just to clarify that. So these locomotives are mostly used for urban work. They're mostly used for commuter rail services in and out of cities. And the 242 was a very early example of that. The 242 was also used on some tender locomotives, but was a pretty rare tender locomotive wheel arrangement to really have. Now, I would be discussing the 444, but usually with these really symmetrical wheel arrangements, we get into a bit of a problem. So usually it is good locomotive design practice to put the heaviest parts of the locomotive on the driving wheels. So that way more weight is placed on the wheels, allowing the wheels to better grip the rails. Because remember, the wheels only touch a surface on the rails on the equivalent of a dime. So that's a pretty small area of contact. So you need all that weight pressing down on the wheels in order to generate enough traction to move the locomotive. However, when you get to these more symmetrical wheel arrangements, you end up running into the issue of which the heaviest parts of the locomotive may not be completely on the driving wheels. They might actually be on the pilot wheels or the trailing wheels, which is a problem because that can cause wheel slip, which can destroy a locomotive if you're not careful. Almost happened to Blue Peter, a preserved Peppercorn A1 class. Or was it an A2 class? I forget. Anyway, so that's kind of a problem. So usually when you see locomotives with symmetrical wheel arrangements, there's a reason why you don't see many of those there. The 440, the American type. Now, this is when you start to get more proper express locomotives. The 440s are very famously used in passenger work in England, whereas in America it was like literally the most common wheel arrangement up until like the 20th century, but you know, we're not discussing American stuff today. So 440s are your small express type. Most famously, this was the Schools class on the Southern Railway. This was the Dunlestaire class because there's multiple types of Dunlestaires on the Caledonian Railway, and was a really popular form of passenger locomotive throughout the late 19th century into the 20th century, and probably until the 50s, when a lot of those smaller locomotive types were being replaced by the more standard British Rail standard steam locomotives, and then later replaced by diesel locomotives. So that's the 440s. They have 4 pilot wheels at the front, 4 driving wheels at the back. It's the heaviest part of the locomotive are on the driving wheels, and having more wheels at the front means that you could have a more stable running, you know, heading into curves, heading into turnouts, that sort of deal. And it also allows more room to put a longer boiler, or maybe a larger firebox with, you know, superheating elements in it, so you can create superheated steam, which allows the steam to be drier and more efficient at powering the locomotive. Now, let's get into one of my favorite locomotive types, the 442, otherwise known as the Atlantic type. I love Atlantic types, mostly because they look so stubby as like big tender engines. Like, this is your first really, really big express tender locomotive. And these things are really cool. You have 4 wheels in the front, just like a 440, 4 driving wheels in the middle, really good, and 2 wheels at the back, which allows for, again, a smoother ride for the cab in the locomotive, so that way the crew isn't being jostled around as much. Could still happen depending on the design, but you know, that's on a class-to-class basis. And then you can be able to put a larger boiler. One of the first 442s in England was the C1, later reclassified as the C2 locomotives, and these ran on the Great Northern Railway. They were created by Henry Ivatt and were an evolution of the Great Northern Railway's 422s that were designed by Patrick Stirling. And at first they had really small boilers, really small fireboxes, not really great use of the wheel arrangement. That's why they were replaced by the locomotive that would later be known as the C1, the large boiler Atlantics. Huge sloping fireboxes, a big fuck you boiler, and you know, it was really making the greatest use of the loading gauge of the British Railways at the time, you know. So yeah, 442s are pretty cool. And now we can actually get to the 060s. 060s. Where to even begin? So 060s are your basic 3-axle steam locomotives, right? You have 6 powered wheels, and 060s were one of the most common types of locomotive on the British railway system until the end of steam. And these things are really cool. They could be tank engines, they could be tender engines, you could run them as shunting engines, you could do them on light passenger and freight work. You can have the larger tender locomotives and put them on freight work or passenger work, you know. 060s are basically your everyman type. They can do anything they were designed for and usually work without fuss. Now, that's not to say that there were bad locomotives, like there's the E2 class of tank engine, which isn't as bad as most people think, but usually people just hate on it because of Tom's the Tank Engine. And if you're a YouTuber that shits on the E2s because they're such a Tom's the Tank Engine, why the fuck do you care? Like, why? Especially if you're this one right here. Anyway, after I did that, so what's a good example of an 060? Currently, my favorite 060 right now that isn't a tank engine is the London Northwestern Cauliflower class. But that's mostly because I've been on a huge pre-grouping kick as of lately, so mileage may vary. Also, 6 coupled wheels with outside frames are fucking silly to me. They just look funny to me. Like, if I wanted a good chuckle, I'd look at any locomotive that looks like this. Anyway, now the 260. The 260 is known as the mogul types, and this wheel arrangement isn't really as common in British railway systems until probably the 20th century, where you kind of needed that extra level of stability, especially if you're looking to make a mixed traffic type locomotive, which, you know, I mean, it's helpful because you have the enhanced stability of having a pilot wheel, but also you can extend the length of the locomotive somewhat. But again, 260s aren't really that common. I mean, there were certainly 260 types in abundance. They're just not they're just not as popular as straight up 060s. And once they were supplanted by 460s for heavier work, usually 260s were not really long for this earth. Except for the British Standard range for their tender locomotives. But that's BR. The 262s. This is not a very common locomotive class in England, so I'm not going to dwell on this very much. Again, 262s, pretty good, I guess. I think some were used for tender. I think some were used for more tank engines, more often than not, but I don't know. Now, the 460. The 460 tender locomotive is your first really big tender locomotive that can be used for a variety of different stuff. The Great Western Railway were famous for pushing the 460 to its absolute furthest, albeit I think the LMS was a lot better at making 460s in terms of, you know, forward-thinking, more modern designs, and, you know, 460s would later become a very common type of locomotive on British metals, and these became popular throughout the 20th century, and almost every railroad had an example of this. Maybe, I'm pretty sure the Southern might have had a 460, but don't quote me on that. I think they might be the exception.
Hi, this is me, post-production, Frank, and I realized that the Southern Railway did have one class of original 460. This was the Lord Nelson class. Sorry for the inaccuracies. Sorry!
Here. Yeah, I think the Southern did have 460s. Never mind. I'm just doing this completely unscripted, so a lot of this is just me going off the top of my head. And now we can get to the absolute peak of British locomotive design in terms of size and commonality. Size versus commonality. And that's the 462 Pacific locomotives. Now, Pacific locomotives weren't really a thing in England because the one limiting factor to making big, huge locomotives in England is the size of turntables. So with a turntable, you can put a locomotive on it, turn it around, and have it facing the right direction. The only problem with that is sometimes it's very expensive to extend those turntables, and sometimes it means redesigning yards, sometimes it means redesigning shed layouts. It's a pain in the ass is what I'm trying to say. Hell, even some of the larger 460s, like the Caledonian Railway, the Caledonian Railway's Cardine class, which is actually two separate types of locomotives, packaged underneath one name, under the flagship locomotive, the Cardine. And the Caledonian Railway really struggled to use these locomotives to turn them around, often having to use Ys, or if they had to use a turntable, they would have to break up the locomotive from the tender and turn each piece individually, which is not a very efficient way. So, what about the 462s? So, the 462 was a wheel type pioneered largely by Herbert Nigel Gresley, later knighted as Sir Nigel Gresley, probably because Herbert's kind of an embarrassing name, and now that we live in a post-Family Guy world, I don't think many people are really jonesing to name their kid Herbert. But anyway, he was looking at what the Pennsylvania Railway was doing with their K2 class locomotives, and he was like, I need one of those. I need one of those. So what he did is he went back to England, went to the drawing office and said, I have a crazy idea for a next generation locomotive. It's going to be big, so you're going to have to bear with me. And so he made the A1 class locomotive, which is one of the most famous locomotive classes in the world, and would later be upgraded into an even more famous locomotive class with, better features and stuff as the London Northeastern Railway A3 class, of which one example remains, and it's the fucking Flying Scotsman. If you're a railway person and you have never heard about the Flying Scotsman before, get out. Just get out. You're a faker. You're a phony. Just get the fuck out. Fucking railway enthusiasts never heard of the Flying Scotsman before. What are you, living under a rock? Anyway, and usually 460s were only pioneered or only mainlined by certain locomotive companies. The only other company that really gave 462s a chance was the London Midland and Scottish Railway, but that was because William Stanier, the chief mechanical engineer, was like, he didn't want to be outclassed by the London Northeastern Railway and decided to get into a bit of a horsepower war with them, making the Princess Coronation class and the Princess classes, the Coronation classes, the really big, tender locomotives. And they nearly had and for a while they actually had the world speed record for fastest steam locomotive, but then Gresley made the A4 and that all went to pot. Plus, the reason the LMS went with 462s is because Stanier was doing a very heavy scrap and build program, where for a while the London, Midland, and Scottish Railway kind of kept the Midland Railway's small locomotive policy, which was basically, instead of having a small amount of big locomotives to handle more work, you have a large amount of smaller locomotives to handle the same amount of work. But with loads getting heavier, trains getting longer, and the fact you start need to double head these trains, which costs more money for fuel and manpower, it's just not doable. So Stanier was like, fuck it, we ball, and built tons of large steam locomotives. Most famously was the Black Fives, or the 5MT class, this being a 460 locomotive, very popular, very capable locomotives that can do just about anything you give them. So the 462s were popular enough where when British Rail came into power after the Nationalisation Act of 1947, and once the railways were nationalised in 1948, they started building a set of standard locomotives, one of which was the Britannia class, but there was also several other subclasses of large passenger locomotives that were all 462s. So 462s were good enough where British Rail kept making them until they didn't, and phased out steam by the end of the 60s. So there's that to look forward to. Now, the 464 class is actually more common than you actually think. These were mainly used by the London, Brighton, South Coast Railway for their large express locomotives, because the railway was so small that they didn't need big tender engines to do the work. They just built tank engines with pituitary disorders and made them do the passenger work. That is until a crash happened on the Southern Railway after the Amalgamation Act, where it turns out that because of the water tanks, tank engines aren't really stable at high speeds. So yeah, good going there. And that's, I want to say, it for the 060s. And normally we would end about right here, right? Well, we still got a few more to go. Now we're talking about 8 coupled locomotives. So locomotives with 8 driving wheels were surprisingly common on British metals. I mean, most of the time they were built for export models that were going to the colonies, but there were some 080s in England, believe it or not. And these were mostly used for slow, heavy freight work. You know, the London North Western Railway built a ton of these, and these were later built by the LMS to handle heavy goods work in the pre-Stanier days. So, you know, that's pretty good, I guess. I mean, having 8 coupled wheels means you have a lot of power, a lot of traction, and because these are freight locomotives, these tend to have smaller wheels, which means you are expending less energy to move the wheels at the cost of decreased speed. But seeing how this is with unfitted wagons with no automatic brakes on them, I think not driving them to high speeds was a really good idea. You know? So there's that to consider. Then there's the 280s, the consolidation types as they were known, and there were several of these. From what I understand, the Great Central Railway built a ton of these, and they were later used by the London Northeastern Railway for their heavy coal trains. So that's interesting. There's still one more 8-couple locomotive left. That is the 282, the Mikado type locomotives. And these things are hella interesting. For one, there's only 2 types of these engines that ever existed in England. That being the P1 and the P2 class, made by Gresley. The P1 class was designed as a heavy freight locomotive to handle coal traffic in the north of England, but for some reason, not a whole lot of these locomotives were built. So, mostly because the LNER was very poor, despite what the pomp and circumstance and, you know, all the luxury of the London Northeastern Railway, they're actually poor as shit. They're broke AF, is what I'm trying to say. So they couldn't build a whole lot of these locomotives, and the coal traffic ended up drying up anyway, so what's the point? Then there was the P2 class, which was designed to handle fast express passenger trains over the hills of northern Scotland. And these were designed mostly to handle the light loading gauge and the steep gradients. And the 282s, the P2 classes, was really notorious for constantly being rebuilt. I swear to God, every single example of the P2 that has ever existed at any point in time were all different from each locomotive. Like, these are like Sturm Tiger levels of meddling in production. It's ridiculous. In fact, some of the P2s end up getting rebuilt by Edward Thompson into the A1-1 classes, which are just really, like, they were good performers, but they just don't look good. Like, they look ungainly, you know. They look like sometimes the pituitary disorder look for certain locomotives just doesn't work. I mean, the locomotive was a successful performer. It did the jobs it handled, so I'll give it that. Not good looks, but good performer. But there's still two types of locomotive that we have not gotten to yet. Let's discuss 10 coupled wheels now. So, 10 wheels, so there's a thing with locomotives where there's only so many driving wheels you can put on a locomotive before a locomotive is just unable to negotiate curves, right? This is why you don't see a lot of O12Os. This is why you don't see a lot of 14-wheeled locomotives. You know, those are very rare use case. Those are very rare, and if so, they were designed for a very specific type of work on a very specific type of route. So usually one way to get around this is to make the middle set of wheels flangeless, which allows it to negotiate curves a little bit better. But here in America, we decided instead of building bigger and bigger rigid frame locomotives, we would just articulate the locomotive and just have separate sets of driving wheels that are on a hinge, so that way they can negotiate curves better. Mostly of the mallet type, but sometimes it works on like things like Garrett's and other types of articulated locomotives like duplexes, which were very popular on the Pennsylvania Railroad. But again, I promised we would talk about just British stuff today, so we have the O10O, of which there's only one example, and it was made for, I forget which railway, but the Decapod is an interesting case where it was made literally just to prove a point. Apparently there was a railway that was being electrified, and one of the pre-grouping railways, I think it was the Great Eastern Railway. I'm pretty sure it's the Great Eastern Railway. They decided, no, you can do it with steam locomotives. So they made this big honking tank engine just to prove a point. And it did prove a point, I guess, because it was kind of successful. But the locomotive was built more so for political reasons than to actually legitimately build a steam locomotive for use. So it didn't really last all that too long. But we do have the 210O. The biggest heavy freight locomotives that were steam powered on British metals. For one, you had one of the austerity types, and that was designed more so to work on lightly built tracks on very light track work. You know, they were mostly designed to run over hastily rebuilt tracks in like continental Europe and the Middle East and that sort of stuff. But there was another type, the British Railway's standard 9F. And these things are enormous. Like, they're fast, albeit they were banned from pulling passenger trains because they lacked a speedometer. These things could haul ass with all types of heavy freight. Very, very strong, very capable locomotives. Gotta love them. Even the last steam locomotive ever built in England was a 9F, that being Evening Star. I don't know why they were building steam locomotives still in 1960, seeing how locomotives were already being withdrawn and being replaced by some pretty god-awful diesel types. Looking at you, North British. You suck. The 9Fs still being built up until 1960, and by then the writing was already on the wall for steam locomotives. Most of the locomotives and British metals would be withdrawn by 1968, but services would continue until 1968. So, yeah. Anyway, those are various Whyte Notation locomotives. If you guys want me to do ones on singles and articulated locomotives, please state so in the comments, because I don't feel like making another YouTube poll about this. Also, considering that I'm doing this in Toho cosplay, I don't think too many people would want to see this video. Bye.